The first part is now we are going to start and have a first presentation within 1 minute. And then we are going to the chapel for worship. And then we will come back to this place for lunch. And when we have lunch, we are expecting actually entire STH community here. So it means about 230 people will be here. So please have your stuff on the table so you can actually claim that that's your table. And also there are some breakfast and also coffee in that small room. And if you need some breakfast, please have that. And the restroom is right around the corner. And if you want to go and use the bathroom, please do that now. And we are going to start our first program within 1 minute. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm happy to help next year.
Nice to see you again. Well, I know we've seen each other before. It's nice to see you again. Aren't you coming? Well, I It's just so good to go on those He's at the University of Pennsylvania. He's doing his doctorate in political science and communication. His defense is today, and I'm just, I mean, I know it's going to go So you're going to be here and make sure that they don't go over time, right?
What do you want for it? I need to be here to take a picture. There is a lot of electric stuff.
I know exactly.
Oh my God. Just to put it on.
I don't have instructions on how to do that.
Good morning again. Welcome to Women in the World.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Okay, so this year is very special, Women in the World, because it is 30 years of Women in the World conference. So we are going to celebrate this all day. And also we have a very special banquet for 30 years of celebration tonight. And now we want to actually open our conference with 3 great speakers. And I want to introduce the 3 of them. If you check your packets and the bios in there, so I'm not going to read all of that. I will just give you the very brief introduction of who they are. Our presenter today is Dr. Diana Swanka. She is an award and grant-winning author, teacher, and scholar who served as a faculty in New Testament and Christian origin at Yale Divinity School for 12 years from 2000 to 2012. She is also addresses, she's actually completing her 2 books and then also working on the 3rd book. And so she is a great author and scholar, and she also addresses the challenges of systematic poverty and economic injustice, as well as women's LGBTQI and racial and ethnic justice, especially as related to religion and the use of the Bible in the modern U.S. cultural movement and debate. She is also very focused on, and also she teaches classes on gender and sexuality. She has been a faculty at School of Theology since 2012. She is a Global Justice Fellow at Yale Global Justice Program and also a research professor of Bible, Religion, and Global Justice. And I also want to introduce 2 more of our also respondents. Reverend Dr. Julie Todd is also scholar activist living in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And she is, as an affiliate faculty for Justice and Peace Studies and Iliff School of Theology, she teaches courses online in the Social Change and Justice and Peace curriculums. As an activist, she works in her community to create transformative grassroots space for social justice education and practice. As an ordained elder in the New England Conference of the United Methodist Church, she works locally and nationally to end the anti-LGBTQ policies and practices of her denomination through the nonviolence direct action group Love Prevails. I believe she's going to talk about that today also. And our last presenter for this section is Xochitl Albizu. She is a PhD candidate in practical theology at Boston University School of Theology, and she's going to defend her dissertation in April. And she already actually got a job offer. She is going to be an assistant professor of religious studies in the area of women and religion and philosophy, sex, gender, and sexuality in California State University, Northridge. So here is our first presenter.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. I am not a morning person, but I have had my coffee. I hope that if you have not, you are going to be on your way. I have been asked to lead us off with a conversation about the struggle for women's and LGBTQI rights in the last 30 years. And I was given a set of questions that are really important. Can you talk to me about the women's rights movements and the relationship with LGBTQI movements in the last 30 years? What are the major difficulties and struggles? And what do you envision for the future of LGBTQI communities and scholarship? These are critical questions. They're also huge. And I'm going to stick to my 20 to 25 minutes and hopefully not bore myself and you any more than necessary. And so I want to say that I can edge in on some of those issues, but my sense and my hope and my prayer is that we together as a threesome can talk about those issues together, and that's what we're offering. It can be easy to talk about these issues as cleanly academic concerns. What are rights, for example? How do you define them? What's the historical relationship between women and LGBTQI struggles? It can also be easy sometimes, even in 2015, and even in academic contexts where there's a little bit of insulation and protection, or in states where there might be a little bit more insulation and protection, to forget the damage of misogyny and gay hatred, which is real and rampant in the world today, in the United States, in the city of Boston, and around the world. So it's critical to remember real people. And I had writer's block about this whole thing until my partner told me, just remember the people. And then I was okay. So I'm thankful to her for that. I'm not going to tell you my coming out story except to say that I was in a statistics class not listening to the statistics, and then I realized I was gay. So at least I got something good out of that lecture. And that was as a junior in college. I was a slow former. But I, like many people, have experienced, though I'm white and experienced many privileges associated with the pallidity of my color. I have experienced a number of physical threats, isolation, extraordinarily ill treatment from Christians, I've been told, by someone who is now a dean of a Methodist divinity school somewhere in the United States, that I could not get a job at that school with them where I had gotten my PhD. Is that clear enough? Somewhere in the Southeast, because I was gay. That I simply could not get a job there, even though he had taught me. These kind of things, and every single year as a professor, every single semester, someone has come into my office with some story. Not a story, but their life. A situation of pain, whether it's about racial hatred or LGBTQI hatred, or something having to do with misogyny. And every single year I have encountered someone who has been abused. Every single year I've encountered someone who has considered suicide. Every single year. I've been teaching, 16 years. So that's half of the 30. So I just want to hold that care for real people in the air as we're talking about these issues. So the first point, I have 6 points I want to underscore. I might get through 2 of them, I don't know. The first I want to underscore is that misogyny and control of whole peoples in the form of nation building, imperialism, colonialism, and the irrational hatred and damage of marginalized groups are interconnected. Misogyny, imperialism, and colonialism, and the irrational hatred and damage of marginalized groups is interconnected and has been interconnected for millennia, historically. And today, they continue to be globally interconnected for women and LGBTQI people, particularly people of color and people from the 2/3 world, both those different groups, and interactively. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. On a daily basis in church and society, all right? So we can't keep these issues separated. We can, it's possible. I'll just keep it on my left side of my head, and this one on the right side of my head, and then I'll just go back and forth like that. But if they really are deeply interconnected, because misogyny lies at the root, at least in my experience as a historian, misogyny lies at the root of much, at least, gay hatred, LGBTQI hatred. And control lies at the root of misogyny and LGBTQI hatred and much race hatred as well. All right, second main point I wanted to underscore, that there are issues of import impacting women and LGBTQI people that are deep and wide. Lack of education, economic opportunity, and poverty headline the list. Globally speaking, lack of education in economic opportunity and poverty, particularly for women with children, particularly for people of color, are one of the most vulnerable groups in terms of lack of education, prohibition of education. Malala Yousafzai, as you know, was shot in the head because she wanted to be able to read books. And she is doing just fine now. In 2013 in the United States, 40% of households with kids, women were the sole or primary breadwinner in those households. Typically, these women are in low-paying jobs. And in 2014, Congress refused to pass equal pay for women. Everybody can do the math of that equation. If you got 40% of breadwinners are women with kids, and they're in low-paying jobs, and Congress won't even pass an Equal Pay Act, you have a cycle of impoverishment set up at this a macro structural level in this country. This is a global problem because education is not a panacea, but education together with economic opportunity has been found globally to be one of the primary creators of transformative possibility for women. Education with equal opportunity for poor women and women in the two-thirds world. Two, part of that, U.S. hate crimes is another issue of import impacting women and LGBTQI people today. Racial and ethnic violence combined in the United States in 2012 comprised the biggest group of hate crimes, 67%. 49% were racially based, but altogether with ethnic hate crimes, 67%. The next biggest group of hate crimes were aimed at LGBTQI people, identifying people. The next largest group, that's at 20%, which is not like 67%, but it's still pretty terrible because killing anyone is killing everyone. Interestingly, the U.S. does not consider violence against women in hate crime statistics. Mom? All I can say to that is, Mom, I don't get that at all. But the violence against women is not included in hate crime statistics. So in part this is, I don't know why. Let's make some guesses later. But domestic violence is massively underreported, and it's a huge, huge problem. It's among one of the major causes of homelessness among women, particularly women with children. We now have between 1.5 and 2.5 million homeless children in this country. And almost all of them have moms who are homeless. And a lot of that is due to violence against women. A lot of that is due to violence against women. There are also a number of honor crimes that are taking place, largely in immigrant communities, including honor killings and acid throwing at wives and girl children who are considered to be not demure enough. Among LGBT hate crimes, rape, molestation, economic discrimination, immigration discrimination, healthcare discrimination is right on up there. And just this number for you, 35 to 40% of lone homeless kids on the street are LGBTQ. 35 to 40% of single homeless kids on the street are LGBTQ. 7% are transitioning or transgender, okay? And this is directly related to cultural and church refusal to embrace, to love these children. 35 to 40% is directly tied to church and cultural ill treatment of those living gay. I want these two things that I've mentioned, the history of misogyny, it's the interrelation of these issues, number one, and two, how big the problems are, or at least how many there are, to be seared into our minds as we remember a third thing, because I'm preaching to the choir, not preaching now. No amens. We are the change agents. It's not going to be like, it's not going to be somebody else who makes change happen. We are the change agents for the next generation of the church and society. If we don't do it, it's not going to get done. The Apostle Paul, I'm a Paul scholar, so I apologize. The Apostle Paul said that we are collectively to be and live as the actual body of Christ in the world. Materially, actually, collectively. A certain 20th century prophet and martyr said that unless a person has found a just cause for which they are willing to die, they are not fit to live. Martin Luther King Jr. A little bit of moral calculus leaves us knowing that the arc of history bends towards justice. I hope they'll forgive me. as he looks on. Not on its own, but if and as we live into our callings to be the body of a loving God in a suffering world. To function as God's body. To function as God's body in the world, transforming it into a place of collective material care and justice for all humanity, whatever an individual's identity or appearance. Fourth main point. By and large, major Christian denominations are still stuck, ossified in sometimes hypocritical debates about the Bible and church tradition, both on the issue of women and on the gay plague. That was tongue in cheek. And it's so in that way are culpable, responsible to a large degree for this situation, doing much more to worsen the situation over the last 30 years than to make it better, by living into the great command, love your neighbor as yourself, which is harder than one might think. There are over 2,000 scriptural verses calling for the intimate material care of neighbor, widow, orphan, poor, exile, and stranger. 2,000 verses. There are plenty of scriptures, I can wrestle anyone on this one, indicating that the first Christian churches fully embraced women and their gifts, and they put them to work, at least in Paul's churches, in all the same roles as men. There's not one text, not one, that ever mentions same-sex contact between women. I wrote on this 10 years ago, and I can tell you that it doesn't matter how much you write, if people don't want to read, they won't read. If people don't want to hear, they won't hear. There's not one text. We've made it up. Indeed, there's no text that discusses homosexuality at all in the ancient setting because, like the idea of rights, or the material reality of stop signs and electric trains, the notion of sexuality itself hadn't been invented yet. They had no idea what we are talking about. And the only New Testament text that clearly addresses male-male same-sex contact is, according to ancient readers, talking about something that is so foreign to our understanding of sex that it is really, truly nonsensical in a conversation about loving, life-giving relationships between men. They thought that never mind, you can ask me later. In the United States, most denominations have, in large measure, and until quite recently, excluded women from the ordained ministries of the church, ostracized LGBTQI people as if they were lepers, and are doing relatively little materially to care for the poor, either domestically or globally. There are exceptions. Women's leadership has been in the fore among Quaker and American Baptist communities for a very long time, praise God. In 1979, the very fast-moving Episcopal Church decided that they might maybe ordain women. But the last 30 years has seen a rise in the role of women, but not in their power. Not in their power. You're going to see a lot of women who are second in charge, but not first in charge. Because all of this is about power and control. Among LGBTQ acceptance, the UU, MCC, Open and Affirming, and movements like the Christian Left and Reconciling Ministries are out there. But again, by and large, the vast majority of denominations, and especially the U.S. Catholic hierarchy and the Protestant religious right have, for the last 30 years, carefully and strategically and planfully attacked women's and gay needs in political coordination. Amen. When they should be doing quite the opposite. There's a long history here, we can talk about it. In a nutshell, that's 4 of the 6 things I want to say. But the U.S. Catholic hierarchy, the Protestant religious right have attacked women's and gay needs in careful political coordination. Randall Balmer wrote a wonderful book and he's got an essay where he talks about the rise of the arguments against abortion and contraception as a cover for the GOP to work on resegregating schools. The leadership of the Southern Baptist Convention was quoted in that time period as saying, abortion is not a major issue for us. These things have risen in the last 30 years as major social issues. They are a cover. First, they were a cover for segregation, racial injustice. And moreover, now they're both being used as a cover, so we'll fight with each other while they work on economic trickle up, or actually economic flow up. And that is, we have plenty of evidence that this is carefully, politically coordinated. All right, so what's happened is the GOP, and I love, my sister is on the religious right, okay? And I love her, and she is a God-fearing woman, all right? So my sister's standing next to me when I say this. The GOP has worked very, very hard to buy the religious right whole so that they would have a white evangelical voting bloc in order to support an economic agenda that supports 1% to 2% of the population.
Yes.
We have good, strong data evidence, not just coming out of my left elbow, that the GOP leadership has spoken to leadership of the religious right and said, we are your religious home. And when folks want to buy something, folk will buy something, won't they? It's about economics and control. And so the issues of women and LGBTQ rights are all wound up with politics and economic agendas, and that feels uncomfortable for Christians who like to focus on spirituality and separate spirituality from the political world. How am I doing on time? 5 more minutes, good. All right. That's 4 of the 6 things I want to say. Those are the problems. What about the answers? Usually, in the West, since the beginning, starting in the 17th century and 18th century, the language of rights was created in the European arena as a way of articulating what is inalienable to the human being. Now, the human being was a male human being and a white human being, all right? But you might think of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. Sometimes it's life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and property. And these rights have been extended. They're in our Declaration of Independence. In 1948, the UN Commission on Rights wrote a document after the Holocaust articulating inalienable rights across a variety of different spectrums so that something like the Holocaust would never happen again. Of course, genocides do and did before. So rights language, which is individualistic and Eurocentric, and was focused first on rights of man, has come to take the fore as the language through which women in this country and LGBTQ, different groups, because they're different, have worked for what are the things we love? Justice, freedom, unshackling, joy, happiness, whatever those things are, located in the individual human being. Wikipedia, I'm not going to go through this history too much. Wikipedia actually provides you a pretty good first-line introduction to a history of rights, a history of women's rights, and a history of LGBTQ rights. It really, really does. So I'm not going to go through that history piece by piece, but what I want to say is that the struggle for women's rights in this country, both in its first wave and the struggle for racial justice, were interactive. Abolitionists were working at the same time and tended to be the same people as, at least on the white side of things, as people working for women's rights. All right, in the first wave of feminism, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony among them. But what happened then, and what continued to happen over time, is at first women would say, we have all these concerns, all the same concerns that I listed. Economic issues, educational issues, et cetera, and so forth. But typically, these movements boil down to, we'll pick one thing. So it became the vote, franchisement. And another thing that tended to happen was folks who had other concerns said, y'all have to wait. Anybody know what I'm talking about? You're going to have to wait. So we come to the second wave feminist movement, which was born out of the strength and beauty and incredible success and devastating heartbreak of the civil rights movement. White women said, we're going to break that glass ceiling. And their black sisters and brown sisters says, what about us? And white women said, y'all have to wait. Y'all have to wait. Those issues, we got to get this first, and then we can work on that. And so the focusing on one particular issue, and right now with women, it's violence against women at the global level. Not education, not poverty, not economic opportunity, violence against women. Okay? So a single issue focus, number one. And number two, this tendency to say y'all have to wait. All right? I'm not sure why that happens, but I do know that it has continually happened over and over and over. So what I want to suggest in my last couple minutes, and other folks will do a better job of completing that kind of picture, is to suggest that we may be doing better. We may do better in our efforts to work together if we work with something other than a rights-based language, although it is the primary language. The language of rights is typically individualistic. It is set by people with power. It is used to control. The right to work is about keeping people from having enough money. The right of the unborn is about the control of adult women's bodies, for example. So rights speech can be used in a variety of different ways. And all of the rights language, though it is very, very powerful, begs the question of some theologically powerful possibilities. Number one, rights language sort of assumes that we're all the same. I don't think we are. I think one of our greatest strengths is the diversity of our experiences and our very differences, and learning how to live into hearing each other in our different experiences and recognizing the great plurality and power of those differences. We see it in the creation. Why don't we see it in ourselves? It begs the question of the interdependent theology of personhood, an interdependent theology of personhood that could ground how we do stuff with each other. We need each other. If we are members collectively of one body of Christ, that means the fingers and the toes and the hands and the feet and the head and the nose and all that kind of stuff have to work together, which is hard, but worth it. And it also begs the question of a theology of community, I'm almost done, a theology of community that could ground fight for justice. The earliest church understood the church as an adopted family. The earliest church understood church as a family by adoption, not biology. Not biology. The earliest Jesus movements, the Paul movement, took a long time for biology to come back in. Family of adoption. It understood itself as collective with shared responsibility, precisely because we could not do without each other. And we cannot do without each other. So I just want to end by suggesting these kinds of theological directions as potentially powerful directions for thinking about the way that women, people of color, and LGBTQI identifying persons can live together in the church and thrive together in the church. Thank you very much.
That was a perfect setup.
Good. Me too.
Will this be magically turned on?
Yeah, it should just come up.
I can see it here. So for me, it's overwhelming. Like everything we just heard, it's just like overwhelming. Which is part of the reason why my default is always to start with church, or to go to thinking about church. Because at least church is like this one place, this one gathering of people, this one collective where we can begin to imagine or practice or embody something different.
Turn the lights out.
The
light is out. Oh, this one. This one. Yes.
You're gonna see some of the artwork pictures that are around my house. And
I'm already jealous.
that's one of them. Yeah, it's awesome. Oh, that question mark was from an old title. Okay. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
That's good.
That's from a LA artist. She goes by the name Pincha Michi. And yeah, it's awesome. That's from her also. So, Professor Swankat, and the question she was prompted with, asked about kind of like the intersection of the contributions, that reflecting on the women's movement, what that can contribute to the struggles we continue today with LGBT identified persons in the society, the struggles they we all are having to face, in terms of the prejudices at play, which is why I kind of said beyond our prejudice. So early feminist theology, with the first wave of theology, which, there was the second wave of the women's movement, of feminism, but really that second wave feminism is what gave birth to first wave feminist theology. Theology is always a little bit behind sometimes. And so with the early, with first wave feminist theology, Rosemary Radford Ruther kind of had the, kind of like the nugget of saying that the critical principle of feminist theology was basically the promotion of the full humanity of women. And not that this was in itself a new thing, she would say, that the claim to full humanity of different peoples was not in itself what was new, but what was new, the uniqueness of feminist theology was that women were claiming this for themselves. And so with this kind of claim, then came new ways of thinking about church, right? Then how do we embody, how do we practice, what do we do when we gather in church to reflect this? just like, I like the images of the women, you know, and the art, because when we enter churches, who gets to see themselves reflected? You know what I mean? In terms of like visually, or in terms of the language in our prayers and in our liturgies and in our songs. So, you know, feminist ecclesiology has done a lot of work to try to, you know, fill this out, you know, to like expand the ways that we kind of embody what it means to be church and how we gather there. And Professor Strong had pointed out, you know, ways in which too often, or, you know, most often and historically, the church has only kind of paralleled the same prejudices that are in our culture. You know, had paralleled and supported even the embedded misogyny and homophobia and kind of narrow kind of sightedness, you know, of in society. And so instead of kind of subverting that kind of order that's in place, too often the church has kind of continued to contribute to it. And thinking about even now when I'm making a lot of reference to Professor Swanka because we got an outline of her notes and we're supposed to be, you know, responding, you know, to her. Oh, she made reference to how, you know, in the last 30 years there's definitely been increase in women's participation and roles in church, but not necessarily in their power, right? And one of there's this book, well, basically in the study of clergy women, some of the ways that this is reflected is that women earn 90% of what male, women clergy earn 90% of what male clergy persons earn in the same positions. Men are twice as likely to be hired as senior pastors than women. And then, if you're a single clergy woman, things are a little rougher for you. Yeah.
Because you might be a lesbian.
Oh, yeah, I can see sometimes that doesn't even occur to me, yeah. Single women clergy are 50% less likely to be hired as senior pastors. And not only that, they are disproportionately placed in geographically isolated and rural areas.
Because we want to keep the lesbians very far away from major city centers.
Yeah. So even, I mean, even in terms of the structure, the way things are playing out for women in the church today, the changes, you know what I mean, are in some areas, but definitely not in others. The depth of transformation has not taken place. So what, you know, feminist ecclesiology, feminist theologians that reflect on the church basically call the church to repentance. You know, I mean, continually. And this is like a continued call. I mean, it's something we have to kind of keep bringing up. And yeah, it's a place that the church is, I can't think so big. Like when you like talk about all the history and like things globally and stuff, like it's so overwhelming to me. I really can't think that big. So all I can think is at least communities, right? These congregations. What can we do with, you know, our congregations and how we gather together? And so the call to repentance, you know, like the sins of patriarchy in the church, are just like who, you know, kind of first an explicit recognition of the ways that the church continues to reinforce these patterns, these prejudices, and then, you know, and then the call for change in terms of our structures, our symbolic structures, our language structures. Do we use expansive language? I was just a guest preacher at my friend's church in Newton Center. And, you know, he knows the work I do, and, you know, he obviously invited me to preach because, you know, like the feminist angle that I bring to everything and stuff. But it's so funny, like how it was just like, there was no, I mean, all the language was just like, Almighty God, Lord, King, like in all the hymns, in the collect, he asked me to pray and everything. And it kind of just tripped me out. Like he had like, somehow like the awareness, even his own kind of progressiveness didn't translate at all into, you know, the words that we are. And I was just like, I mean, just kind of was like surprising to me. I was just like, I didn't expect it, you know. But I mean, it's like huge. It's still an issue of not even thinking about expanding our language that we use for God. You know, the images, the metaphors that we use. And so it begs the question of still whose experience gets considered, taken seriously. You know, not just women's, but you know, LGBT identified persons, people of color, immigrant experiences, like all of these things. Whose stories are we listening? You know what I mean, like to, and allowing ourselves to be changed by. Who are we hearing into speech, and who are we not hearing into speech? I had lost. Oh my gosh, it's already 20 minutes. Oh no, 10. It's 10 minutes. Oh.
Exactly.
I also can't do math. So, oh yeah, even in terms of how we gather, in terms of structurally in our spaces. So when I get the chance to speak with congregations and church communities and stuff, how do we even like create space for us to think about these challenges, these changes, and how do we like move into them? How do we open our mind up to imagining church in different and expansive ways? And I love studying the Bible. I'm not a Bible scholar. I wish I should have been. But I just love the stories, right? Like the stories can capture our imagination. The Gospel of Mark is my favorite. And I always like to start, so even just like my sermon this past Sunday, I start with like, what does the Gospel of Mark start with? So it starts, first of all, Mark is calling us to reflect on the beginning. His whole story, like he's writing this like gospel. He's telling this narrative to people who are already familiar with it in some sense, to communities that already identify, but he's like calling them back to the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. So already like, whose good news is it? Like, how do we understand this good news? Well, it's Jesus' good news. We're gonna see this in Jesus somehow. And then the start, Jesus is not the first character though that shows up in the beginning of the good news. Mark Gospel basically then draws back from history, draws back and says, as it was written in Isaiah the prophet. So already, like there's a calling back to a trajectory, like a whole history that has preceded it. So like, it doesn't start just with the moment, it starts with like something that's continuing. And then the way it continues is with a messenger that's gonna come to prepare the way. So I love that the good news starts with a messenger. Like, it starts with a call to prepare. And the call to prepare is a call to repentance. To say that, to be baptized in, John the Baptist, so the messenger is like the first character. John the Baptizer is like the first character that shows up, calling for baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And so like when you think about who was responding to this, it was people for whom this narrative was already part of their lives. You know what I mean? It's like the people, Mark's very dramatic. I love, the whole people, like everyone in Judea and how things happen immediately and stuff. So that's, my point being that like when I'm talking to churches, I like to remind us that our whole like good news starts with a call to change, to rethink, to go back to the beginning, to think about how we missed the mark, and then and then the story continues. From there, Jesus shows up, and then he's also baptized. He's also washed, and then we get like the skies break open. You got swooping wind, and so now this is the person to watch. And then it goes from there. And then I love for us then to go to the end of the Gospel of Mark, because in a way, this whole beginning and this whole call for change and repentance ends in terror. And ends, with the women like now believing that, this is continuing. Like Jesus is no longer in the tomb. he's gonna meet them in Galilee. This story's not finished, it's continuing. And so like, how scary that is. You know what I mean? They leave like in terror. So anyways, I just always like to like remind us, you know, like as the people who identify as Christian and gather in congregations, to this call to change. So even in the ways that we think we have church figured out, that we need to go back to the beginning and recall, you know, the ways that we, you know, missed the mark. So I realized that I think my family is the kind of my first in a way, my family served as my church. Was the first church I knew. Like there was ways in which I was shaped in my family that made the way I think about church and Christianity different from the get-go. And I like this book by Tom Bradenhall, I think it's called. It's called The Sanctification of the Household. Because what he, and you know, it's a response to the opposition of gay marriage. And it's from the 80s or something. But what he says is like, what we practice in our households is a way of what we're extending, you know, our practice of how we relate to people beyond our household. So we're practicing something there so we can sanctify, you know, like make right, you know, the ways that we are family in the household. And he means household, you know what I mean? He means like all the people that could be included in the household. He's not talking about nuclear family. He's talking about the old way we understood household that included a lot of different people and generations and extended relatives and adopted relatives, you know? So then I think about then church that way. It was very easy for me to translate that to the way I understood church and thinking that it doesn't just look one way ever. So I don't know that you all need this, but so then thinking about, you know, how first wave feminist theology helps us rethink about church, and what we're like kind of embodying there in terms of whether we are continuing like the embedded misogyny and sexism of society in churches. It's the same kind of thing with LGBT identified persons, right? Like, what are we practicing? What is what is left undone or unsaid or unreflected in the ways that we have gathered in church? So one of the, you know, queer theology then builds on the understanding that sexuality is not this fixed universal thing determined for all time, right? We don't have like, we can't package it and know what this looks like, and so now we just, you know, but that this is, the reality is that sexuality is something that, that's expansive, that's fluid, that doesn't look just one way. And so then queer theology draws on that by saying like, what are the ways in which our theologies are reflecting a sexuality as if it's fixed, right? As if it only looks one way. So if we think about the critical principle that Rosemary Redford Luther talks about, we can then also apply this critical principle to the full humanity of people of all different sexualities. You know what I mean? Not just what we have institutionalized as a norm. Which, so, you know, I have a lot of heterosexual friends and family, and there's nothing wrong with being heterosexual, right?
We love you anyway.
But what becomes problematic is when we institutionalize this in the ways we form church or family, as if that's the only way to be in relation.
Yeah.
So then, you know, heterosexuality becomes heteronormativity when it gets institutionalized and fixed. You know what I mean? So it becomes fixed. And so that nothing but heterosexuality gets affirmed and celebrated. So the same thing, we can then think about the same critical principle about the full humanity of people in terms of, you know, what stories are we telling in church? whose images do we see in church? You know, what hymns and metaphors for God are we, you know, who gets to see themselves reflected? So it's the same kind of, we can think about that kind of framework to think about, you know, church. So, you know, same thing. The same kind of like challenges that feminists raise in terms of like women's, the affirmation of women's full humanity in church, we can think about the affirmation of all of our different ways of loving and being Roman or not. Yeah, even like, I mean, single persons. You know, we make big deal about, you know, weddings or like baby announcement and things like that. When my friend just, there was an announcement sent out celebrating, you know, one of, someone, you know, just had babies, you know, and a whole announcement comes out to the community, you know, to celebrate the baby. And then my friend emailed me, he's like, my dissertation is my baby. Will they make an announcement when I have my baby? So, you know, it's just like, who gets celebrated? You know what I mean? Who do we, who gets to see themselves reflected? So, and one of the things, so, I keep going back to my family because there's ways in which you're shaped by your family you don't even realize until way later. When I was like 9 years old, I remember we were all at my cousin's house, and there was a lot of people there, and you know, it was a big family gathering and stuff. And then my older cousins, I see my, so I had my tia Leti and my tia Sofia. So my tia Sofia was my mom's first cousin. And so my tia Sofia and my tia Leti, we always like just knew them together. They'd always show up together. And so I saw their car. You know, we all love my tia Sofia and my tia Leti. And so I saw their car and I was like, oh, my tia Sofia's here. And then my older cousin said, no, that's your Uncle Tony now. And I was like, my Uncle Tony, that's my tia Sofia. They're like, no, that's your Uncle Tony. And so I go ask my parents, and I was like, you know, Mom, Dad, you know, Tiny and Alex are saying that my tia Sofia is my Uncle Tony. They're like, yeah, that's your Uncle Tony now. You know, you can call him Uncle Tony. And I was like, okay. And that was it. So then I had my Uncle Tony and my tia Leti. You know what I mean? It's like, I didn't need to know anything else except that, yeah, that's your Uncle Tony now. And it was not a big thing. It was just something that was just part of our family, just changed a little bit. You know, my tia Leti became my Uncle Tony. It was not a big deal. And so when we just reflect that, you know what I mean? When it's just part of what we do, you know what I mean? So things, you know, expansive language, different images, different artwork, if it's just part of what we do organically in the churches, you know, you just go, yeah. Women can reflect the divine. Yeah. You know, a male couple does, you know, reflect the loving, beautiful relationship. You know, maybe we can even think about polyamory. Maybe we can think, you know, the household, the family doesn't just have to be about two adults in relationships. Maybe there's different ways to think about how we form loving families. And we can think about that in church.
Super exciting. I want to thank you for the invitation, Kian, to come here. I'm privileged to be on this panel with Sochi, who, though we really hardly know each other, are intimately connected through a Shaw woman, Reverend Dr. Tiffany Steinwert. And so we feel like we know each other, even though we practically don't. And I really got the notes from Professor Swancut's lecture, and was like, this is going to be great. And then we got to meet and just jiving with a lot of things. So it's an honor and a privilege to serve with all you. I hardly believe that I graduated with my MDiv from here like 20 years ago. And now I'm on a panel at Women in the World. I mean, it's pretty great. And I just want to honor the role that the Shaw Center played in my formation as a woman, as a feminist, as a pastor, and as a prophet. And the relationship that I have with Shaw women are the central relationships of my life to this day and continue to form me. I'm gonna cry. And I want to just take the personal privilege to honor Margaret Wyborg in this moment, who was the director of that, who did nothing but encourage me in two very important areas of my life, which were courage and self-care. And I'm probably just getting a handle on the last one about now. Always, always, so thank you.
You'll need it more as you get older.
So I actually want to begin by reminiscing a little bit about the period of time that I was in seminary here, celebrating the 30 years of the Anna Howard Shaw Center's Women and the Word and Women in the World conferences, and in order to give a little bit of context and history, right, directly to where we are today. And I do want to jump back 20 years, 1995, which would have been the beginning of my third and final year in seminary, as I was preparing for ordination exams and pastoral ministry. And in October of that same 1995, not out of Woman and the Word, but the Shaw Center gave the then named Pioneer Award to Jean Audrey Powers. All right? Jean Audrey was ordained in the United Methodist Church in 1958, one of the very first women to be ordained fully and have full membership in the United Methodist Church. Right? These women are still alive in our generation, the first women who were fully ordained. But also in 95, just before she received the Pioneer Woman Award, she retired as a very highly placed denominational leader in the United Methodist Church and came out as a lesbian. All right, so her timing in getting the Pioneer Award was pretty interesting. But she likened her closeted life in the ministry as a subversive strategy of resistance within the United Methodist Church. All right, her fully closeted life in the United Methodist Church. Now, at that event honoring Jean Audrey, I believe she selected theologian Virginia Ramey Mollenkott to speak. And Virginia Ramey Mollenkott called the church a war zone for women. This is a quote from an article which I wrote for the Shaw Newsletter in 1995.
All right, Julie.
A territory occupied by the unfriendly tyrants of the heteropatriarchy. And in this war zone, Mollenkott told us, women and all gay people had a right to appeal to the ethics of war, in which lying and withholding the truth, particularly when it came to ordination for gay people, could be considered situationally, ethically acceptable. All right? And she said this with all the kind of clarity that just completely blew my mind. Right? Like, yes, you can lie. All right? Which is, of course, was the status quo, and in many ways, I hate to say, continues to be the status quo, primarily within at least the United Methodist Church. Right? Lying and or withholding the truth with regards to sexual identity, gender identity. So in March of 1996, I completed my ordination exams. In April of 1996, I went with two other Shaw Center comrades to the United Methodist General Conference in Denver as a part of the campaign for the then named Reconciling Congregation program to make a witness for LGBTQ inclusion and against the anti-gay policies of the denomination, which have only worsened since that time. And at that General Conference in 1996, my first of 5, I encountered repeated and publicly sanctioned, denominationally sanctioned hate speech towards lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer persons for the first time in my life. Pleasant experience, about to be ordained the first time I publicly hear hate speeches at the General Conference of the United Methodist Church. So in that year, 1996, would also become the General Conference at which it would become a chargeable offense for United Methodist clergy to preside at same-gender unions. So when I was asked during the annual conference of that same June if, relative to my ordination, I would uphold the Book of Discipline, which includes upholding the highest standards of Christian living, including celibacy and singleness and faithfulness in marriage, and not marrying gay people, I literally crossed my fingers, put them behind my back, and I lied. And, I mean, everybody does it, right? So, I mean, you don't have to clap for me. I mean, it's sad, of course, right? It was like, ooh, you lied, now you're saying it out loud.
But at least you remembered to cross your fingers.
I did, that was very important. It was a very childhood resistance type of act, right? So, I checked in with God, and Virginia Ramey Mollenkott had given me just like the absolute explicit permission and for my subversive strategy, and Jean Audrey was the role model. But here I would like to be explicit about what I lied about. I really hate to do this here because thank you for the affirmation of heterosexual people. I'm actually a straight person and an ally. And so I was an ally that I knew that I would do same gender unions, and so I lied about that. I have done them and I will do them. So I lied about knowing I would not uphold the Book of Discipline.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it was obvious to me, actually. But what I was really also withholding consent from was the entire notion of celibacy and singleness and faithfulness in marriage, because that was bullshit. I'm looking at my parents over here, right? Hi, Mom, hi, Dad. Because, I really understood this because of my feminist education, which took place in the Shaw Center, and not really, I hate to say formally speaking, in the Boston University School of Theology, right? Which really at the time, I don't know if other women there at the time, was not feminist friendly. Better, I guess, than it had been in the 80s, but not really, right? We weren't really learning feminist theology per se. So what the Shaw Center women helped me to understand was that the language of celibate and single is not expressive of an ideal about holy living, it was about control, right? Yes. And this is where I want to dovetail with Professor Swancutt's speech, right? Of course, this singleness, celibacy, fidelity in marriage was never applied to straight men, as far as I know, single or married, who violated these rules with impunity over our history. But it was a means of policing sexual behavior on the part of parties deemed by patriarchy to represent the greatest threat to male power. That's right. And that includes single people, thank you, of all sexual orientations, gender identities, polyamorous people, transgender, non-binary folks, lesbians, gay men, transgender folks, I said bisexual, queer people, right? The church's policies around sexual behavior help to maintain heteropatriarchy as a war zone so that sexually and gender marginalized people do not know the power they have to subvert dominant paradigms by organizing themselves differently, as the early church suggests was possible, right? In household ways, right? And so, because sort of creating other forms of community that don't conform to capitalism, which of course, straight marriage, and now gay marriage, are forms of capitalism, legal marriage contracts which accrue economic benefits to those people who enter into those contracts, all right? So, I spoke for already. But I also came to understand in that period of time, right? I want to just kind of go back to this point about control then, right? That celibacy and singleness and celibacy and faithfulness in marriage is a form of social control, which is at the heart, right? And we kind of think of this phrase in the United Methodist Church as sort of excluding gay people, but it's about much more than that, right? It's about misogyny, right? It's about the control of, well, heteronormative control, right? Partnered control. And, tries to kind of really put a clamp down on expansive sexuality, different configurations of relationships. I also came to understand at that time, again through the Shaw Center and the publication of Hardball on Holy Ground, I believe that it was called, which was a book about the Institute of Religion and Democracy trying to destroy the mainline Protestant church, right, which include the United Methodist Church. The complex of right-wing conservative institutions and organizations that fomented anti-woman, anti-gay movements and efforts in the mid-90s used so-called morality and values issues as a means of diverting mainline Protestant denominations away from other racial, economic justice issues, right? Professor Swancutt also made reference to this. Elevating the economic status of the wealthy was and continues to be the primary goal, that's right, of right-wing conservative theological and political movements in this country. So they continue to use sexuality and abortion as wedge issues, and the way that debate is then really the center, for example, of the United Methodist Church, makes our claims to the gospel of love completely unsupportable, and has prevented us then from really having any meaningful racial and economic justice witness in the world, because we are preoccupied with this. And believe I'm one of the most preoccupied people with it. So, and racial and economic justice were my original passions in the life of justice, in my life as a church person. So, you know, we're left with no clear prophetic voice on any matter whatsoever, as far as I'm concerned. You know, and I think that that's true of other mainline Protestant denominations as well as my own. The progressive theological left, and this relates then more to the academy, is completely complicit in that lack of prophetic speech and language that, you know, really motivates people in the pews, right? So though we may despise the vision and the clear moral speech of the right from our particular progressive perspectives, as Professor Swanka sort of points out, you've got to give props where props are due. The Christian conservative right was very successful in grassroots organizing of people and money and clarifying a moral vision. They did it and we didn't. We got no one to blame but ourselves for that, right? We cannot blame others for that. They are committed, right, to grassroots organizing. And they speak with a clarity about what is right and wrong. And we do not, right? We do not. That's my experience in the United Methodist Church. And despite the successes of the gay marriage rights movement, despite the existence and growing visibility of Christians that are disobedient to and question the legitimacy of denominational structure, the vast, vast majority of people in our churches are still living under the terms of lying and withholding the truth. Questions of misogyny remain almost fully unaddressed, as do the questions of matters of poverty. I'll talk a little bit in a minute about this group, Love Prevails, this activist group that I'm involved with in the denomination. We're standing at a Council of Bishops meeting with literally just our pathetic little signs that, you know, had these statistics about LGBTQ homelessness among youth, about poverty among queer people. We're holding them as the bishops are leaving the room and people are like, really? I mean, these are the bishops of the United Methodist Church. They're like, wow, that's really something. You know, like, these are not widely understood, right, by the main denominational leaders of our church, despite that we may understand these things ourselves. So, let's see. We're left without clear speech and a prophetic moral clarity. That's where I left off before I started getting off on that. So I wanted to question at the best framework, and Dr. Swancup was getting at this, for addressing the matters of misogyny, capitalism, and white supremacy is also this framework of rights. And here I want to honor the living spirit and memory of one of my mentors, Dr. Vincent Harding. It's going to make me also want to cry for a minute. He just passed away this last year. He was a historian and a veteran of the struggle for black freedom, and who always tried to shift people away from speaking about the black freedom struggle as civil rights. And he always used to say, you know, use the language for the struggle for freedom, because the struggle for freedom is so much more than the struggle for rights, right? And that can be true as applied to any community, right? Rights are really about justice for all. They're not about community, they're about the individual, primarily. And rights always end up being rights for some, and not rights for all, right? You know, so the cascading victories for gay marriage rights in the larger scheme of global queer liberation, you know, the minority of LGBTQI people are benefiting from gay rights and gay marriage in this country. By far the minority. And many of those benefits for the few, again, are primarily economic. At the same time, within this country, while the gay rights and gay marriage movements are like, hurrah, you know, we're winning, the rights of African Americans and Latinos are being trampled on, right? I mean, what's the relationship there, right? I mean, there's an obvious relationship, right? Gay rights here, voting rights dismantled by the Supreme Court, right? And why is the gay rights movement, marriage movement, getting so much media, right? And the Virtual Destruction of Voting Rights Act is, you don't even hear about it, right? Unless you're listening to alternative news of some course, maybe PBS. So, these things are intimately related, as we're trying to sort of make the point of, right? So, because of our limited imaginations in the United States also, and particularly because white people have so thoroughly sanitized the civil rights movement, We also think of pursuing rights primarily as going through the normal institutional means of change, right? Legislative processes, lobbying, right? Gay rights movement and marriage movement have been extremely successful at this tact, right? But then that influences the way that we think that change is made, right? Legislative strategies, right? The language of rights is the way that we achieve justice, and that really tends not to be the case at all. Now, the language of rights is the language of the state, right? It emerges when the state emerges. Is the language of the Bible the language of rights? Can you think of a scripture where it's about rights? Right? That's not actually our language, but the church has capitulated to that language. Right? The language of the Bible is, as we know, liberation, salvation, redemption, reconciliation. Right? It's not rights. And so we sort of really limit our imaginations to what the struggle looks like and what the language for the struggle looks like when we continue to talk about rights. But then furthermore, as far as the actual pursuit of rights goes, we also think about our struggle having to be within the formal institutional channels of change. Right? And we know that the formal institutional channels of change are foreclosed to those people who are most marginalized by the institutions themselves. Right? So gay people within the United Methodist Church are never going to win legislatively. Well, I mean, with God all things are possible. Right? So, however, right, it's not going to happen merely through an appeal to sort of persuasive legislative strategies, right? I mean, the events, the Black Lives Matter movement, the people in the streets of Ferguson and throughout this country are saying, right, the formal institutional channels of change are foreclosed to us and we must be in the streets, right? So that's part of what the language of rights limits us to thinking about. And as the group that I'm involved with, Love Prevails, but also as generally tends to be my entire mode of operation, is disruptive, right? Right? We need a multiple pronged strategy, but more people need to consider themselves agents of change, right? We're a very small group of people. This group Love Prevails is like 12 of us. I'm not even kidding. People think we're enormous. We're like 12 people. We've been in existence for about 2 years. We show up at United Methodist Council of Bishops meetings, what we call our connectional table, which serves as an overall leadership and administration council for the church. And I should just mention that Bishop Morgan Ward is probably more acquainted with the work of Love Prevails than any other person in the United Methodist Church. And just sort of, as I go talk about this, I want to recognize that you're in the room. And our sort of final demand in this disruptive strategy we have is that all the language, the anti-gay language for the Book of Discipline must be removed. Right? I mean, there's no other way around it. And in good faith, some of our ally folks try to craft solutions whereby we might find regional solutions or like almost like a states' rights solution where some regions of the country gay people could get ordained and could marry same-gender couples, and in other regions of the country, if they're not ready for that, well, then they don't have to do that, and they can set up maybe their own laws. And maybe some, like in New England, probably clergy could do same-gender marriages, maybe not in Alabama. And then people say, well, we should go with that, right? Like, that's a step, that's great. Well, you know what? That's rights language, right? And that means some rights for us, and that means no rights for other people, and that has no theological basis whatsoever when we appeal to our own language of liberation, salvation, justice, reconciliation, right? So I think we need to kind of do away with that. We go back. The only road to justice for LGBTQ folks in the United Methodist Church is the complete removal of the anti-LGBTQ language from the Book of Discipline. All of it, right? And until you church leaders who, you know, frankly, mostly agree with us, lead us in that direction, and you are nonetheless unwilling to lead in prophetic ways, we are here to mess up your order. That is what we're here to do. And actually, it doesn't take much. You'd be surprised. It doesn't take much to step into. All we gotta do is show up with our pathetic little signs, and they're like, ah. That's my impression of the Bishop Ward. So the formal institutional change, the formal channels have to be forced by other means. You know, and they've responded to us by repressing us in most possible ways, the worst of which, of course, is the liberal silence and smiles from allies. Changing the rules and procedures to keep us from participating as observers, calling the police, having hotel security surveil us, making open meetings closed. So, you know, and really, we're just like 6, 7 people when we go there. And the thing is that if by some incredible miracle the language in the Book of Discipline were removed at our next General Conference, which is 2016, we're still going to be left with celibacy and singleness and fidelity in marriage. Right? Which is the key to social control and is based on misogyny and patriarchy. Right? So even if we clear away the rights issue, and of course we're still going to be left with homophobia and sexism within the church, we just will have the rights to do what people are called to do. So in the meantime, a lot of people who want to be in the system of church and stay in continue to lie and withhold the truth at every level. The change of the denomination is that there are less people, gay, straight, trans, queer, whatever, who are willing to do that anymore. And so we are engaged in less subversive, right? More overt, non-institutional, non-reform oriented strategies of open disobedience. And we need more people, is the bottom line. We need more people engaged in all forms of change. Whether we're talking about the UMC or in the streets and broader struggles for racial justice, we need to be people who are willing to disrupt the status quo, right? We are the messengers, we are the change agents. I guess that's where I want to leave it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's time for the questions, and we have actually standing mic there. If you want to use the mic, please come forward, and probably maybe 2 or 3 questions maximum.
I think I can talk loudly enough. Can I?
Yeah.
I can. I practice. So Julie, it's so wonderful to hear you. And I hate to be a pain in the rump. But I think we need to say a little bit more about the message of the Bible.
Please.
Because you talk about the Bible talking about liberation, salvation, and all of these wonderful topics. And I heard you suggest, perhaps I heard wrongly, that we don't find language of the state.
Oh, right.
But when you look at the laws and a host of other texts that are in our Bibles, laws that uphold patriarchy and injustice across the broad breadth of persons and so on. There you are finding language that is institutional, whether you're talking about a monarchy or a tribal grouping or the larger family house. So yes, what you said about the Bible is there. But I think also that we have to acknowledge that much of what we find in our Bibles is not liberative or salvific. And I feel the indictment against liberal biblical scholars who have not spoken out as they should. But I think all of us need to be aware that to say the Bible says is never the conclusive argument, because others whose views oppose us diametrically also can say, the Bible says.
Perfect, yes, I agree.
Anyone want to answer?
Go ahead, no, you. No, you go ahead.
I want to affirm what you just said, while also saying there is the concept of rights as it has been conceived since the 17th century isn't there. You're absolutely right, and it is an indictment of liberal historical critical scholarship to not talk enough about the control mechanisms of monarchy and of governance that many movements within Israel, including the Jesus movement, were pressing back up against. But at the same time, there is a lot of language that is not there. And for example, Paul's primary word, redemption, the actual Greek word is apolutrosis. Apolutrosis is freedom papers. It means that people can no longer be enslaved to the empire. And so you have that kind of language, and it's particularly adoptionist kind of language that that is very extremely powerful and does take the fore over against a kind of biological base. Jesus, one of the hard Jesus sayings is, if it is not, you are not my father, my brother and my sister and my mother and my father are those who are members of this community. And that is, you don't preserve that kind of saying unless it goes way back, because it's really not acceptable, right? And so we have these hooks that we can bend into about freedom from being chained, and about adoption into a family of love of other that is really quite strong, I think. So I think both, yes to what you're saying, but also as the biblical scholar too in the room, there's a lot of opportunity that we need to not let go of, because they can't, if you can't, if you know the biblical material, say it's about homosexuality. It's not. It's not there.
They had no concept of homosexuality.
Exactly.
I agree on that.
Anyone else?
Hi, I like the idea, and I think all three of you mentioned, I don't have to use a heavy voice, I have a mic. The idea of subversion has always intrigued me, because I have found myself in places where people have not recognized who I was. And it's great to be a fly on the wall. It's great to be you're right beside me.
Sorry about that.
And I can't think of what I'm saying. I like to be a fly on the wall in places where people don't really recognize who I am. And I'm a lot of things. So I am much more than I appear to be. And I like that idea of subversion, because I think in order to accomplish what our goals are, in order to be the change agents that we seek to be, we must be subversive.
That's right.
But being subversive requires courage.
That's right.
And having courage, as human beings, we need others to support us. So I come to conferences like this, and I hear these concepts, and we discuss these things, and then we go away and there's no follow-up. There is no network created where we can support each other in our struggle to advance freedom, redemption, liberation, reconciliation, salvation. So the challenge is, what do we do, and how can we develop that network of support again so that our cause can be advanced, that we can work with each other in our various areas. I need to mention that my primary area is immigration, because I am an immigrant. So where immigration intersects with so many things, the capitalist society, huge. And the debate that we are having on what do we do with immigrants and how do they affect the economic status of the whole country, feeding into that 1 or 2% of the people who really own all of the wealth. Big pop.
Can I say something to that? I just wanted to say that one of the best things Tiffany Steinwert said to me or encouraged me to do as I don't know if it was during the end of my master's program or the beginning of my PhD program here, but I was struggling with not having that sense of support for thinking thinking theologically in feminist ways. I didn't have like the conversation partners, to help me in the classroom, so to develop that in me. It always felt like I was learning that against the grain, kind of. And she was already gone at that point. And she said, you can't expect to have the support you need here. She's like, you have to go out of your way to create that, network for yourself. And she says, just find places, just look for the people and just ask, and so I've been, it's one of the things that has made all the difference in my life is that I basically learned to intentionally form those networks for myself, even with people that I just barely knew, and I was just like, well, she seems highly regarded by people, let me just ask, and like now I have these, I have a group of 4 women, and then there's a group of 3 of us in terms of like, different things. So different networks of support for different things that we just have our regular meetings, we like check in with each other, we like, raise our kind of questions to one another and like use one another for resources, and do you know someone who can do this, da, da, da. And so just in general, that's one of the things I try to encourage even students that I'm a TA for, just like who are like energized by these ideas and they want to do this activist work but just don't even imagine how, and I just like, just find your people and stick to them, just like, commit to them, commit to one another, and just like be there for one another. But yeah, having to form our own networks, we do. We just have to do it ourselves.
Diana, I may have not heard you correctly, but I've always, as a United Church of Christ pastor in a Methodist setting, I'm always a minority, and I didn't know whether you mentioned the history of LGBT work in the United Church of Christ. Did you?
I did not have time, no.
Okay.
Would you
No,
like
not,
to say
no,
something?
just to say it. You said MCC, but I just think United Church of Christ needs to be acknowledged for the work it's done for many years in support of LGBT.
And let's lift that up. Let's lift that up. Because especially, I so hear you, especially when we feel alone, there are groups of people, but we tend to be segmented, and if we can't find each other, we feel alone. So especially when we feel alone, to know that there are strong people and loving and caring people who are doing this work denominationally with great courage, and my friend said you have to have a strong backbone. Strong backbone, walk like a lion. Right? So yes to that. The challenge, I think, is going to be is exactly what you're talking about. How do we find ways of not only having conversations that are excellent conversations, but bringing groups of people who are doing wholly disruptive work together so that they can be wholly disruptive together, right? And create change from the grassroots level up.
I don't feel like there's other questions, so I'd rather hear from you.
Oh,
Ditto, that's all I have to say.
I think this is.
Go ahead, whoever had the first hand.
Please.
Okay, Susan, yeah.
Hi, I'm Juan Jen from the New York Annual Conference. I serve on the steering committee for mine.
Oh, very good.
For this trip out to Rutherford. We've done both disruptive, subversive behavior as in live into the reality. We started doing the gay marriages, writing up the stories of people who did gay marriages, and the Tom Ogletree case that we provided the tax fund and whatnot for. But we also do both legislative work in the conference, and I think it's not either or. I think it goes together in part because, like you said, it's not a single rights motion. We're trying to coalesce with many people on different intersections of issues. And so one of the concerns is that you don't have enough people. You know, you have 7 people that are disruptive, and how do you get more people to do the work together? So I think it's important that we do the legislative piece with the disruptive. And one of the legislations that we're working on, I had an email right before I came out here, was because they're using the spiritual language of impoverishment or enrichment to the body by being inclusive. And I think that one of the things that we need to do, and the question I asked was to name concrete ways in which heterosexual clergy are economically privileged. If you're going to talk about enrichment and impoverishment, it can't just be spiritual language, it really has to be materialistic collective language. And since I'm a heterosexual clergy, I don't know the benefits that the gay clergy do not have. So I'm trying to gather information on what can I name in the legislation piece that says, these are the material benefits that heterosexual clergy gets, and thus makes the body less whole. So I'm trying to name those privileges. I'd like to ask you, and maybe if we have gay clergy in the room, what are the material benefits that I can name in the legislation that says, and I threw that out there before I came, so I haven't gotten feedback from the committee, but that heterosexual clergy need to own up to. These are the privileges that you're benefiting from at the expense of whether the gay clergy is out or not ordained or not out. But you are gaining these material benefits at the expense of these other body parts. So do you have any concrete practical benefits that we can name in our system? If it does nothing else, it will at least bring to light and have people own up that if you're ordained clergy, you have these benefits at the expense of, for example, people not telling their stories in ordination and going through it lying. So we are gaining our ordination by the spiritual harm of those who have to lie through a system that is set. So what are the material benefits? Can you name some?
I'm not sure, do we have the time for that? I mean, again, I'm also a heterosexual.
Yeah, but maybe expect 5 more minutes. Yeah, spend 5 more minutes and then.
Yeah, if you want to speak to the material, because I just wanted to affirm that a multi-pronged strategy is actually what I would be advocating for as well, right? Obviously, from my own position, like I believe in disruption. However, I teach social change theory, and you actually do have to have the whole spectrum, sort of liberal to radical, right? Legislative reform oriented to more radical disruptive. And actually my concern is less for, I said not less for, because I really want to advocate for people to have more courage to be disruptive, frankly. But I just want people to act. You know, whatever you want to do, like do something, because actually the level of action is so pathetic when you consider the larger picture, and the people are dying, and queer kids and stuff, right? So I would just want to affirm that, yes, I actually do affirm this, a larger, broader strategy.
And that's just from my lived experience as a Korean woman trying to get other ethnic people to join the work, that if they see it as a single issue movement, it's very difficult.
Which is also a reason like why you don't have to dismiss actually the language of rights or operating within that framework, because it is a framework that we have which does motivate, in which people understand, right? So even though as we sort of criticize rights language, you know, and I criticize legislative reform-oriented strategies, that's not to say that they don't have validity and necessity.
I think that's the breakdown between the first movement of feminism and the second movement, is that, you know, you're leveling out who's suffering more.
And, yeah, which is terrible. You know, it's if I suffer more, then you don't count. My strong suggestion to you, I decided not to become ordained when I came out, which was in 1989, because I didn't want my partner, who is now my wife, spouse, as well. I didn't want our lives to be only about that, because it's only one part of who I am. I would strongly encourage you to be bold, to seek out groups like Reconciling Ministries and every major Christian organization you can find working on these issues, in order to do an applied questionnaire, applied research, and so that you can also get firsthand stories and applied research nationally. I would do it nationally. Find everybody you can. And if you know someone who knows a statistician, get them to go to work on it so that you have a group who can you can help prepare a report that goes to a national body that includes story and data. Because right now I don't think that we have the data. What happens is folks who are out don't get hired, or they go to court.
And I'd be glad to provide you with some connections if you're looking for something for annual conference this year. If that's part of what you're asking. Some people that would be willing to talk to you about Gateswood.
Thank you. Now actually the worship time is actually happening right at the moment, so you might want to move really quickly, and we will come back to have a lunch here, and we will continue the conversation, and we just to put up the fire here, so we will burn the fire all day today. Thank you.
Dramatically since the 1970s, particularly in such denominations as UCC, UMC, PCUSA, ELCA, Disciples of Christ, and the Episcopal Church. According to the Hartford Institute Religion Research in 2010, around 10% of all American congregations have a female as their senior or sole ordained leader. Although I could not find updated information, I assume that the number has increased since then. Clergy women are actively participating in leadership roles, serving as local parish ministers, district superintendents, and bishops within church hierarchies, as well as chaplains and spiritual care directors in hospitals, schools, industry, the military, and business. Moreover, many seminaries and theological schools have female students making up more or less half of the student body. And many of them learn preaching from female homileticians. Maybe in master and student, but obviously, these changes have brought women more egalitarian environments to participate in the ministry of preaching. These changes are the fruit of our four sisters' long and strenuous struggle against the patriarchy within the church and academia. Then, does gender no longer matter in the church?
Say so.
Yeah, I see, some of you are still wondering, you're shaking your head, yeah. I agree with you that although we see a sea change in gender, female leaders of the church in North America, as well as other parts of the world, still face sexism, deeply embedded in institutional systems and individual mentality. Now I figured out why this is not working. I put some animations, and then animations is not working. It's not working. But that's fine. So it's not a big problem. So I just do whatever. I figured it's fine. Okay. Well, Reverend Melanie Rose, a UM clergywoman, shared her own experience like this. In her church, there was a pious couple who were active members serving the church in numerous ways. One Sunday, she found her husband absent from this worship. And then the following Sunday, he was absent again. So she asked his wife about his absence. Then she replied, "Reverend Rosette, don't you remember that you call God our Father and Mother in the Sunday service a few weeks ago. My husband was very offended by your naming God the Mother. He was so upset that he decided not to attend the service anymore. I consider her story just a tiny tip of the iceberg of clergy women's experiences on a daily basis in the midst of the sexist mentality of the congregation. Well, in my co-edited book, Women, Church, and Leadership, Reverend Rose also states that these days, the number of female clergy in the UMC is decreasing because many of them are giving up their ministry due to lots of complaints and the lack of support from the congregation. Dr. Hee-Yeon Chun's research on clergy women retention study 2 echoes that the number of clergy women in local church leadership is decreasing due to the lack of support from the hierarchical system of the church. As you might know, ethnic minority congregations who are less exposed to egalitarian culture in their native countries and even in the US are more sexist to female preachers and pastors. A few years ago, one of the Korean female UMC pastors in Denver was appointed to a Korean UMC. In spite of her perseverance and tearful prayers, she could not survive the severe storm caused by the congregation's sexism and had to leave that church in 3 years with a new appointment to a Caucasian church. As a Presbyterian, I'm a DCSA member, I often envy the UMC's appointment system. Particularly, it's a bold and adventurous cross-cultural appointment of clergy women to local churches. When we look deeper, however, their context for preaching is much more complex, facing double or triple discrimination, not only by sexist mentality, but also by racial prejudice and cultural conflicts. Last October, I was invited to lead preaching workshops for Asian American Pacific Islander clergy women held at the Claremont School of Theology. It was amazing that the majority of the conferees were Tongan American, and that the second largest majority were Korean American clergy women who were serving as local pastors in aging and dying Caucasian churches. According to my observation, they seemed to be very courageous to dive into the deep water without sufficient training and swim gear. Actually, I'm a swimmer, so without them, wow, it's very dangerous. They were desperately swimming against the strong currents of sexist mentality, racial discrimination, and cultural biases. Through conversation with them, I learned that their only survival gear was their spiritual discipline with prayer and a strong sense of the divine calling to preach. Are these enough for women to do the ministry of preaching in our globalized, multicultural, and sexist environment? The impact of globalization is very real in local context. In fact, we live in a globalized world, which means global plus local. So our local context is under the impact of globalization. And one of the examples would be the situation of my own church. When my family joined this church 13 years ago, we were one of a few ethnic minority families in the 300 membership Caucasian church. Yet, this church has gradually changed, becoming more multicultural. And now, about 20 to 25% of the attendees at Sunday services are non-white. And the number is increasing every year. One of the reasons for the change of congregational demographics is that some church members are actively working for the Sudanese refugees in Myanmar. And they bring some of them to our worship services. Moreover, since the church is located in a good school district, the Sag Creek School District, from Denver. So Asian and other immigrant families move near the church for their children's education and come to our worship services. Perhaps my husband, who sings every Sunday in the church choir, plays a role as a good token minority. So wow, Asian is a choir, so maybe we can join this church, and that kind of comfort is given. Well, the problem, however, for my pastor is how our preaching should respond to this changing congregational culture and effectively appeal to the listeners beyond their racial and cultural differences. The increase in racial and ethnic diversity in our globalized local communities has brought forth complex multicultural issues on race, culture, religion, and the economy. And it demands the church reconsider its identity and role. For female preachers, the majority of whom are serving more culturally diverse congregations, these multicultural issues are more realistic than male preachers. It was very interesting to me to know that the last winter quarter, and I reviewed the quarter system, and then last winter I taught the online course, Worship in Multicultural Context. And then out of 12 enrolled students, 11 were female. And they were licensed local pastors. For them, multiculturalism is a crucial issue because their congregations are either multicultural or ethnically and culturally different from their own. So they cannot help asking the question, how can my preaching and worship leadership be more relevant to my culturally different congregation? And how can I be more faithful to the Christian gospel as a preacher? These questions challenge contemporary preachers, women and men alike, and it leads us to reconsider what kind of a homiletical paradigm would be effective to preach the good news of Jesus Christ in our globalized multicultural context. I think the vision for the future of women preaching should be constructed by taking seriously these difficulties and struggles: sexist mentality, racial discrimination, and globalization and cultural conflicts. then what kind of preaching theories and practices then can be effective for the future of the preaching ministry? As an answer to this question, I propose a new paradigm of preaching as a shared ministry. In my essay, Preaching as an Art of Shared Leadership, included in the book Women, Church, and Leadership, my poetry book, I propose preaching as a shared ministry. The idea about preaching as a shared ministry is originated from the concept of partnership between God and female preachers. As I already mentioned, in history, God has always initiated partnership with women by calling them to work as God's partners to actualize the reign of God in the world across different times and places. Considering that nowadays most female preachers are no longer itinerant evangelists, but pastors of local churches, the concept of partnership in preaching challenges us to reconsider its significance even in relation to congregation. More precisely speaking, partnership in preaching should not be limited to the relationship the preacher has with God. It needs to be extended to the relationship between the preacher and the congregation. This idea leads us to consider a new leadership model of the church. The prevailing sexist mentality in church and society makes female pastors feel that the traditional patriarchal leadership model does not work for their ministry. While the traditional concept of leadership is hierarchical, with the pastor as the leader and the laity as the followers, and is maintained by the hierarchical power of authority, female pastors experience that such authority is not given to them as readily as to the male pastors. And that even if it is granted to them, it is not very helpful to fulfill their ministerial vocation. Because the more they are involved in church leadership, the more they feel that the Christian ministry should be a shared ministry with the congregation. With the collaborative and shared leadership, they want to encourage the members of the congregation to participate in the ministry as their partners. In the shared leadership, authority is understood in a new way. Those who have a sexist mentality are used to understanding authority as the power of control possessed by the person who stands on top of a hierarchical system. And they do not want that person, be a woman, who has traditionally been regarded as inferior to men. The authentic meaning of authority, however, is in essence relational rather than hierarchical. And it is rooted in God, who is its ultimate source. In her book, Growing in Authority, Relinquishing Control, Celia Han articulates this concept of authority as this. God has granted authority to people in manifold ways as abundant commodity or gifts to share with others. Authority in the church, therefore, is not a position that the leader should make every effort not to lose in competition with others, but God's gift that is supposed to be shared with others as a means of building up the community of faith. Many pastors who were raised in the environment of clerical elitism, tend to regard preaching as their distinctive privilege and right that they should not give up. Consequently, the pulpit has been the most exclusive place that represents the clerical power of authority. The understanding of authority as a gift, however, makes it possible to understand the pulpit as an inclusive, communal place that should be shared with others, not only with collegial people like associate pastor or student interns, okay, but also with marginal groups in the church, underrepresented based on race, gender, sexuality, language, and social and economic status. The inclusivity of the Christian pulpit opens the church to constructively deal with multiculturalism within and beyond the church. In other words, if preaching is understood and practiced as a shared ministry, the pulpit can be a place of exploring who God is and what God is doing in our multicultural world by listening to the stories and the testimonies of racially and culturally different people. I name this homiletical approach the transcultural method. It's not working. Well, just as the term trans means through and beyond, it's not simply jumping up, but through and beyond. So the transcultural method is to go through and beyond one individual culture, either the pastor's or preacher's own ethnic culture, or that of some people who represent the dominant culture of the congregation, and engage in different cultures in the congregation in order to create a more inclusive congregational culture. The transcultural method of preaching aims to read the times and discern the will of God for the world through careful and critical listening to the people who are from different racial and cultural backgrounds. In order to fulfill this goal, preachers, women and men alike, need to equip themselves with some ability, such as a theology of diversity, inter or trans-religious hermeneutical disciplines, and culturally diverse rhetorical skills. Above all, the transcultural method requires of both preacher and congregation honest openness to God and others with respect to diversity. Respect. Respect is a willingness to show consideration or appreciation for someone who has a different value orientation and life experience. By respecting differences, the preacher and the congregation can place their egos at the service of others. Some of you may be a little confused whether preaching as a shared ministry is against clergy-oriented seminary education, but that is not true. Rather, shared preaching demands of the preacher not only her sufficient knowledge and experience in preaching, but also her passion for educating her preaching partners to be faithful witnesses to the word. Thus, the image of the preacher is multiple, including that of a teacher, facilitator, a coach, and the leader of the congregation. Most of all, the preacher's multicultural competencies are crucial elements of shared preaching. That is, the preacher needs to have a cosmopolitan personality. By increasing her general and specific knowledge about and broad and deep experience of other cultures. At this point, I think one of the most significant tasks of theological education for the present and the future ministry of preaching is to help preachers and would-be preachers equip themselves with a cosmopolitan personality. Ideas of shared preaching are numerous, as long as the preacher and the congregation are creative in thinking of preaching. I remind you that our four sisters in the history of preaching were creative and imaginative in their theology and method of preaching. I think we need to inherit their capacity of creativity and imagination. Designing a sermon as a dialogue with preaching partners rather than as a monologue by the preacher alone, or as an embodied performance, including singing, drama, dancing, and other artistic elements, by inviting those who have such talents among the congregation, are just a few ideas for shared preaching. Well, one of the best sermons I heard as a shared preaching was a class sermon in my course, Preaching and Social Ethics. A few of the students chose the immigration issue as a topic and researched its complexity through interdisciplinary studies with social sciences. And then based on their research results, they selected Matthew 6:25, 34. Maybe you remember, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear, the passage. And then they interpreted it from 4 different perspectives. From there of an undocumented immigrant, and then law enforcement agent, and ordinary Christian, and the last was a voice of the biblical text. And then the sermon was written as a dialogue with these 4 characters. And 4 group members performed the sermon by playing the 4 different roles in it. Well, for the effective practice of shared preaching, it is useful to organize a preaching committee. I know many churches have a worship committee, but I'm not so sure that your church has a preaching committee. But the preaching committee's role is, they're very broad. Its role is to participate in recruiting preaching partners, and also preparing and performing and evaluating the sermon afterwards. So you can use your preaching committee very effectively in order to share the message with others. A variety of creative approaches to preaching will challenge the church to rethink its identity and vision, and contribute to revitalizing the church with fresh insights into and passion for a communal and collaborative ministry. Ultimately, the practice of preaching as a shared ministry will bring forth a new chapter of the ministry of preaching, not only of female preaching, but of Christian preaching in general.
I'm really pleased today to offer my response to my esteemed colleague, Anju Mary Kim, and her careful reflection on this set of issues around women's preaching, and on this, especially on this occasion, the 30th anniversary of the Women in the World Conference. It's a high note. I'm pleased because in my estimation, she's one of the leading researchers in my field. I really am excited to have her here, and I'm glad to be sharing this time with her. I myself have enjoyed her scholarly work over the years and frequently used one of her books, Preaching the Presence of God, in a lot of my courses over the years. But more than that, I can't fail to note that a large number of the PhD students with whom I've worked over the years have been gravitating toward your research and thinking deeply with you. They've all gravitated toward it in part because of your insightful contextual analysis and theological depth. Dr. Kim also demonstrates her ability as a practical theologian by dialoguing with a range of theories in her work, which she always engages with great skill and, even more importantly, never without solid theological moorings. Unju Mary Kim is a leading homiletician, but above all, she's a wonderful theologian. She manages to remember that preaching is about God, God's presence in the complexities of race and culture and gender. This deep theological sense, to my mind, sets Dr. Kim's work apart. And for me, this is no small thing. In her book, Women Preaching, Theology and Practice Through the Ages, Dr. Kim speaks openly of the struggles of being a Korean international student and a woman seeking to teach and conduct research in a field dominated by men, both here in the US and in Korea. Dr. Kim is a groundbreaker and has stayed true in the midst of the struggle, and to the point where her work is recognized both here and abroad. At the same time, she does so while speaking openly of the presence and activity of God, in which she and we are all called to participate. She is, especially for these reasons of struggle and steadfast perseverance, a homiletical theologian to be reckoned with. Her life and her scholarship and this anniversary event meet today in a profoundly significant moment. In her lecture, Dr. Kim has spoken eloquently to the three questions posed by Dr. Che around women and word. Number one, what have been the major transformations? Number two, what struggles remain for women as preachers today? And number three, how does this history create a new vision for preaching? In Dr. Kim's words, I hear an appeal to a great cloud of witnesses. Women who through the ages have been motivated by a profound sense of divine presence and call, speak with rhetorical creativity, and in the process, pry open closed realities of sexism and patriarchy for the sake of the gospel. Her great cloud of witnesses includes the first witnesses of the resurrection and takes us all the way to more recent preachers like Jarena Lee, Anna Howard Shaw, and Hwa-Soon Cho. But in the midst of her words, I also hear echoes of other voices, and in my mind I kind of hear it in the voice of Rebecca Chopp as well. In her book, The Power to Speak Feminism Language God, Rebecca Chopp says, quote, feminist theology speaks deep religious sensitivity, words full of word, and as such, words of grace, healing, wholeness, new possibilities, and crucifixion and resurrection. To understand how feminist discourses proclaim word to and for the world is to speak of God and God's movement in the margins and fissures of the world. Chopp goes on a few pages later. The radical activity of feminist theology is, in my judgment, nothing short of a portent of transformation of Christianity itself. Such a transformation can be identified best by examining the discursive practices of feminist theology and expanding these practices to the transformation of basic Christian loci, such as proclamation, word, scripture, church, and witness to the world. In many ways, I see Dr. Kim's work as a deep embodiment of Chopp's concern for marginality and also the embrace of a transformation of Christianity itself. Of course, I have questions that I'd like to probe with Dr. Kim. For example, what is the nature of the cosmopolitan personality that she advocates? And what kinds of cultural competencies is she calling for? And yet, what I wish to focus on for the balance of my time in response today are two implications of Dr. Kim's work today. And you will see that these implications are viewed from my own location as a white, male, mainline Protestant homiletical theologian. These two implications for me have to do with, one, the transformative impacts of Dr. Kim's work on gender and transcultural preaching, for the problem of mainline church disestablishment, and 2, the unleashing of the constructive metaphorical power of a new vision for preaching as shared ministry that Dr. Kim has articulated. So first, the first implication, which has to do with the question of how the mainline Protestant church has been impacted, and how this relates also to the question of the issues around sexism and the need for multicultural engagement. Canadian theologian Douglas John Hall has argued that the challenge of liberation theologies for North American mainline churches is to push an ever deeper contextualization, to move beyond the fiction that the mainline Protestant church somehow occupies a universal stance. This is a task which still needs to be taken up and pursued vigorously. Part of what perpetuates the struggle over a disestablished white mainline Protestantism is its sense of loss over cultural hegemony and a displacement that challenges both white privilege and entitlement. While the rise of a kind of post-liberalism, represented by people like Willimon and Hauerwas, seeks to reinforce a now dislocated church by means of a well-defined countercultural identity, it is, to my mind, at best a kind of rear guard action for dealing with disestablishment. And by contrast, Dr. Kim speaks of the diverse voices of women preaching in history, as well as the interlocking nature of patriarchy and the need for response to the church's multicultural situation. It thus occurs to me that many of us who fret over disestablishment of the mainline church fail to see its connection to a broader need of responding profoundly to an intercultural situation. Perhaps the disestablishment of the white mainline church must also be seen in relation to what Dr. Sarah Travis has called in her recent book, Decolonizing Preaching. Dr. Kim's careful analysis of the interlocking nature of these realities gives me hope that even a mainline white church might begin to see its response to disestablishment as being more than reinforcing a fractured sense of identity, and instead being more culturally open to its multicultural context. As a white, male, mainline Protestant homiletical theologian, I find Dr. Kim's work invites me to a dialogue around gospel and culture that goes much deeper. If the way of naming such disestablishment requires describing the white mainline church as, quote, in exile, such a metaphor must also account for the ways in which power and privilege persist even after the relative dislocation of cultural disestablishment. Kim's project has seen diversity through the history of women's preaching, and her vision of transcultural preaching can offer a way forward. There is, in short, in light of Dr. Kim's argument, much theological work for us to be doing in the pulpit. A second implication has to do with the constructive and metaphorical nature of that theological work in the new visions of the rhetoric of women's preaching and the new vision for preaching a shared ministry that Dr. Kim has articulated. She speaks of the new vision in 2 ways. First, in terms of women's preaching through the ages. Such visionary rhetoric for Dr. Kim is by its very nature subversive. What resonates for me, however, especially in light of Dr. Kim's earlier work in Preaching the Presence of God, is the recovery of eschatology as a form of critical transcendence for preaching. Martha Simmons argues that eschatology is important for preaching, not just because it offers unattainable utopias, but because of the power of the juxtaposition of the future and present. Eschatology, says Simmons, is where the sweet by and by meets the nasty here and now. Or, as Dr. Kim has put it, God has revealed the divine attributes through the voices from the margins in more inclusive and imaginative ways, so that we could better understand who God is and what God is doing in human history. Hearing women preach, we receive more fully the total human consciousness of the divine, and hear more completely the wholeness of God, which means the presence of love in the midst of our unjust reality and the vision of God's realm for the future. For me, this profound sense of the nature of our theological task as preachers today invites, I hope, all of us to think of preaching as a taking up of the unfinished task of theology. It invites us to see preaching as embodying the best of both practical theology, yes, and constructive theology. Already, theologians like Sally McFaig in her book Metaphorical Theology invite us to see theology in the tension of the is and the is not of metaphorical language. The language of metaphor is not about just ornamenting ideas, but living into a tensive reality that names God into the world again. That this task requires us to engage with the tradition and practice opens up new ways of spawning a shared conversation around the gospel in the church. And precisely by attending to life in its gendered and multicultural fullness and diversity. This may mean that we preachers learn to live with the theological tradition in a more active way. Consider the story of the Syro-Phoenician woman and her daughter in Mark 7. Here we have a story of great Markan subtlety, requiring insight both in terms of the gendered conversation that takes place between them and the socio-political complications of cultural relationships between Syro-Phoenicians and Galileans. And yet, in Mark, there is this gracious and yet difficult back and forth between the Syro-Phoenician woman and Jesus that ends up just prying open the gospel a little bit wider. In my wife's congregation, the Lutheran Church of the Redeemer in Woburn, there's a prominent woman who offers leadership in worship, sometimes reading scripture, sometimes as a communion steward. What is interesting is that when she comes up to help distribute the communion elements, she often lays hold of the top of the scripture lectern to push it back from the edge of the marble chancel. She does so to make room for those giving and receiving the body and blood of Christ. Can we learn to make room? Can preaching learn generally to attend to the deep connection of theology and practice that underlies Dr. Kim's new vision? I am convinced that the constructive task of theology and preaching will benefit from just such a robust new vision. A vision of shared ministry in the living Word of God. I commend you, Dr. Kim, for your work and look forward to what is to come.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm going to come at this a different way for obvious reasons.
All right.
So allow me to echo the sentiments of gratitude expressed by Dr. Kim for also having the opportunity to participate in the 30th anniversary of the Women in the World. For 30 years, the Anna Howard Shaw Center has served as a beacon of light for women. Through the years and in a diversity of ways, your work has been a light in the midst of darkness, charting unseen paths for women to follow. Over the years, the center, under the guidance of various directors, and for the last 13 years, as I heard earlier today, Dr. Che has remained steadfast in her commitment to supporting women through providing sacred space, research opportunities, discussion groups, workshops, warm couches, free coffee, tea, and refrigerator space. For your hard work and dedication, we certainly owe you and the Shaw Center a debt of gratitude. We have heard the 3 questions posed by Dr. Che, so I won't repeat them. Now, in reviewing a brief history of the major transformations of women preaching, Dr. Kim shared what she observed as distinctive aspects of female preaching. She identified those distinctives as rhetoric, more specifically subversive rhetoric, or the rhetoric of reverse, theological imagination and construction, creativity and style, and finally, the last but most important, as she said, a sense of calling to preach. I would like to dovetail on Dr. Kim's final distinctive shift the angle of vision a little to a different area of the margin, and examine the call to preach and its implications from an African American perspective. Many of you may know the call to preach is, how shall I say, very important in the traditional African American religion. It is a must for us. So to do so, I will briefly touch on two areas. One, the call to preach, and second, a little high-level overview of the Black church as we are, some of us are today. In 2004, I was sitting in the auditorium of the Baptist World Center in Nashville, Tennessee, attending the morning lecture for Christian educators. Reverend George McCaleb, former pastor of the Green Forest Community Church in Atlanta, was presenting on the effectiveness of his Sunday school model. At some point during his presentation, he did a quick pivot and began to talk about the composition of his Christian education staff, which naturally segued into the configuration of his ministerial staff. And for whatever reason, he made a point of highlighting the work of his female ministers on his staff. Immediately, I sensed a shift in the entire auditorium, but also there was a shift immediately in me, because I realized the magnitude of what he said and where he stood as he said it. During the Q&A, the questions from the men narrowly focused on the Sunday school model. However, as I recall, there was one woman who rose that day. I remember it as clear as it was yesterday. As she approached the microphone, she recognized and gave honor to all of the men sitting on the dais. Then she said, "Brother Pastor, I understand your support of women preachers, but a woman will never pastor me." In 2009, in a conference hall in Houston, Texas, again, while waiting for the start of the morning lecture, now in the Ministers Division of the National Baptist Congress, the dean asked all preachers under the age of 25 to come to the stage. I watched as the next generation of preachers mounted the stairs onto the stage. I wondered if there were any women brave enough to slip out from among the 3,000 who were seated in the auditorium that day and step into her calling. Again, this was a National Baptist meeting. As the dean looked upon the group on the stage, there were both male and female there. And it was at this time that he made a startling declaration. He stated to all of us who were present, 99% male, that God does the calling. And it was our job, the 3,000 seated in front of him, to support and train our young ministers, both male and female. These two vignettes reveal the continuum within which female preachers in a number of Black churches now exist. The opportunities for ordination, pastoring, leadership, etc. lie somewhere between these two poles, somewhere between total affirmation and support and definitive rejection. However, God will not leave God's people without a witness. As the witness, as our vignettes confirm, fortunately, as from 2004 to 2009 display, the winds of change continue to buffet the rejection of God's elect, even in National Baptist. But even as we sit here this afternoon, this may not be the reality for many Black female preachers who dare to answer God's call to the preaching ministry. Yet in spite of the difficulty and the possible lack of affirmation, the call of God on their lives is stronger than any resistance they encounter. As Dr. Kim said, it is a must-do. In turning our attention to, we will now turn our attention to the meaning of call. Teresa Fry Brown in Weary Throats and New Songs define call as an irresistible conviction, urge, pull, command, motivation, or attraction toward a particular person, place, or thing. In terms of ministry, a call is a divine mandate imparted spiritually. It is God's command for a particular purpose. She further states a specific call is given to an individual for the benefit of the community. Answering, responding, yielding, and submitting to a call means giving up one's own will for the ultimate reward of doing another's. In essence, it means standing in the image of the prophet Isaiah and responding, "Here am I, send me." It is a willingness to go, absent of any assurances. Now, writing somewhat before Brown, Samuel Proctor and James Massey also highlight the importance of call. For Proctor, in A Certain Sound of the Trumpet, he emphasizes the personal and volitional nature of God by stating God is both transcendent and immanent. God enters into history at God's own will and makes known to the individual that he or she has been singled out to be a special agent of the Most High. Interestingly, he adds that there are no absolute verifications that it is God who's calling. But we must walk in this uncertainty, trusting and believing that which we think that we've heard is God. Turning finally to Massey, who in The Burdensome Joy of Preaching takes an additional step by focusing on the relationship between call and anointing. For him, call is similar to that as defined by Teresa Fry Brown, that it relates to God's conviction on one's life, and it yields a focused identity and sense of purpose once answered. In conjunction with call, the anointing of God is the sense of being identified with God's will in relation to a specific need, then having the basic instinct about what needs to be done about it. As such, Massey makes known the necessity of the working of the Holy Spirit in the life of the preacher. Now, the final aspect related to call is how the call develops. And many of us in our various ways can attest to this. Brown states that the call develops in three possible ways. First, there's a cataclysmic or reluctant call, which stems from a momentous event, either natural or supernatural. Second, the call of destiny means that one is born into, groomed, or nurtured into a consciousness of vocation. And then lastly, there's a gradual call which unfolds over time amidst reluctance. Taking these three together, it is clear to me that there is something mystical about the call of God on one's life. It is a divine partnership, as Dr. Kim alluded to earlier, that the call is entered to with God. That God provides no guarantees of success, no roadmap to follow, only the opportunity to transform the lives of God's people. Now, numerous women throughout our history have responded to God's call. However, their responses were not without cost. Each in their own way endured unimaginable hardships such as leaving spouses and children, denial of ordination and pastorates, lack of support, criticism from other women, sexism, loss of friends, etc. Even so, not responding to the call presented an even greater hardship. Dr. Kim mentioned a few notable women who answered God's call. However, I would like to add a few to the list. Rebecca Cox Jackson, who left her denomination due to the rejection of her call. And as a result, she started the African American Shaker community. Mary L. Tate was the founder of the Church of the Living God, the Pillar, and the Ground of Truth Church. Dr. Olivia B. Stokes is the first woman ordained by National Baptist, and Harriet A. Baker, evangelist and possibly the first woman to pastor an AME church. In the case of Jackson and Tate, and like so many others, when barred from the pulpit, which should have supported them, women sought creative ways to serve out their calls up to and including planting new churches. Preaching has long been central to worship in the Black church. Birthed from the invisible institution and established after slaves were freed, the Black church quickly became the center of the community. Robert L. Smith from Strength to Strength says, the African American church is that body of Christian churches which is predominantly made up of people who are descendants of Black Africans brought to the United States during slavery. In this body, there exists a diversity of denominational affiliations, theological positions, religious practices, and socioeconomic standing. Accepting this diversity, there is a Black collective reality or experiential dimension that flows out of Black ethnicity, cultural particularity, Black Christian faith, and a shared history of oppression in America. The shared history of oppression is characterized by communalism and freedom, says Eric Lincoln. He writes, in Africa, the destiny of the individual was linked to the tribe or to the community in an intensely interconnected security system. Hence, the communal sense of freedom has an internal African rooting, curiously reinforced by the hostile social convention imposed from outside of all African Americans as it can. Cheryl Townsend jokes in If It Wasn't for the Women, relying on the analysis of Tom Weber, explains further that the shared suffering and oppression of slavery produced a slave community characterized by a remarkable lack of sexism. Although the Black male preacher was the leader recognized by whites in their religious institutions, Black women emerged as worship leaders, preachers, catechizers, exhorters, prayer warriors, singers, teachers, and storytellers, all authoritative agents of the Black religious tradition. Now, as the church came into its own, it became a nation within a nation, says E. Franklin Frazier in the Negro Church in America. The church became a place of refuge, a place where all obtained dignity and justice. The church served as comforter, leader, moral agent, and intercessor, the place where all achieved some recognizable status and a defender of all that is good and right. As the church continued to evolve, the Black church became a staunch defender on issues of justice. Francis Wood writes, when issues of justice arise, the voice of the religious leadership from the Black church community were often both loud and adamant in seeking corrective action. Nevertheless, in order for the free Black church to conform to its counterpart in the dominant culture, it was necessary to suppress the freedoms with which Black church women had exercised in their roles previously. When the invisible institution of the slave religion went public, the woman question was one of considerable debate. So let's say that again. When the invisible institution of the slave religion went public, the woman question was one of considerable debate. And in many cases, it remains so today. The shadow of patriarchy and sexism now continues to invade the sacred space of one of African Americans' most cherished institutions. However, it is here that I believe that the concept of shared ministry, highlighted by Dr. Kim, may have application. Shared preaching has the potential to stretch the current thinking about God, and more importantly, to impact the practices around patriarchal leadership and authority. Additionally, if the current leadership becomes intentional about shared ministry, the abolishment of the big chair phenomenon between both male and female clergy, along with the possibility of erasing the line of demarcation between pulpit and pew. It is here that Dr. Kim, in many ways, with her concept, challenges what I call status quo theology in many black churches. Now, I believe that as long as we continue to name the evil in the room, as Christine Smith suggests, that we too have the opportunity to make a change. As we look to the future, we do so looking back from whence we've come. African American preaching women are strengthened by the voices and testimonies of those who have come before. We are fueled by the difficulties they endured. And while some continue to lead to carry out their call, and that we understand, there are those who remain determined to do the work of change. The strategy going forward, I believe, is to stay in the room, to keep showing up, and to continue to preach the truth of the gospel. Thank you for listening.
Any questions? It's always, hard time to get the first question, and then I always have a hard time to actually start the last question, so.
I have a very short question because I don't want to miss the quote. Dr. Blue, Reverend Blue, the last line that you said, stay in the room, keep showing up, and was there a first before staying in the room?
No, ma'am.
Thank you.
Okay, any questions?
One more. Dr. Kim, I thoroughly just want to say thank you. I have 2 seminarians in my church that have graduated recently, and I'm in the old model. So sharing the preaching committee, all that you've said, I will gladly. I see it starting to happen, so thank you.
Can I add some comments on Dr. Jacobson's question about cosmopolitan personality, and then also Dr.
Jackie Wood's
concern in relation to African American Church. Well, first of all, Dr. Jacobson's question reminded me of my DB student in class a few years ago. He had served a rural church in the northern Colorado. And he complained, in fact, saying that these days there are so many migrant workers in my community that they come to my church. But the problem is, my church has been, the Euro-American church for over 100 years. Mm-hmm. And then whenever Hispanic migrant workers come to my church, I feel very uncomfortable because I do not know how to minister them. I do not know their language. I do not know their culture. And then I feel very uncomfortable. I'm not so sure he has a cosmopolitan personality. And then one of my Korean friends who just immigrated to the U.S. about 7 years ago, they talked with me, and then he shared his personal experience in the U.S. like this. On the first Sunday when he they settled down in Denver, he visited a church just near his house. There is a Caucasian church. he was very curious about their worship style and the sermon, and I think his English is much better than my English anyway. And then he visited that church with his family. And then after church, he went to fellowship room having coffee, and then the pastor came to him and then just to shake hands, and then I will show you something, please follow me. And then the pastor was very kindly, they led my friend outside the church building. And then he said, you see this road? Just to go 3 blocks to the right side, and then turn left. And then go straight for about half a mile, and you will find a Korean church. I'm not so sure he has a personal personality. And then I don't think, the cosmopolitan personality means a kind of perfect person in culture. No, I think there are many different stages of personal and cosmopolitan personality, according to my understanding. If you are open to different cultures and curious about different cultures, I think that is the beginning stage of building up your cosmopolitan personality. And then if you can respect other cultures as seriously as your own culture, I think that is perhaps the second stage, to getting mature in gaining or building up your cosmopolitan personality. And then through education, the theoretical schools and in our society, if you are all the time open and curious, by learning something new in different culture, and I think that is a kind of process for us to become a cosmopolitan, the person. So, I know some people who have a very much, intercultural or cross-cultural life experiences, living in different parts of the globe. It's a really good gift, I think. But even without those gifts, we can try here in the U.S. because our U.S. culture is what, as I mentioned, global culture. So we can experience globalization and the global cultures here in our local communities. So please, let's open ourselves, and then be respectful,
I served at church some time ago. We used to have in the beginning, when the church was, the United Methodist Church was trying to become more inclusive, had what was called Personhood Sunday. And so I decided it would be good to have a worship service. I didn't want to give up the preaching entirely. But I invited 5 other women from our church to come up and talk about what their sense was about opening the church to women. And after this, Mary was one of them, Mary Taunton was one of them. And after the church, one of the most powerful men in the church, also the greatest giver to the church, came up to me and told me what he really thought about letting a woman be in the pulpit. And he asked me if I would tell Mary, go back to the kitchen where she belongs and never come back to the pulpit. I guess I struggled for a while about how to respond to that, and even nowadays, I'm retired now, so I don't preach much anymore. But how do pastors like me and others, how do they do you have some suggestions about how doing that particularly? In the United Methodist Church, you elect people to do the work of the church. Some suggestions as to how men in particular can open themselves up to convincing their congregations that it's okay to do that. I mean, now it's decades ago when that thing happened to me, but there's still those feelings out there.
Perhaps one of the ways for the pastor, to help, their kind of congregant, to open to, the cultural diversity, is that perhaps the pastor can invite him to be a member of a preaching committee. And then have lots of conversation, how we can, help our congregation experience, multicultural preaching and multicultural worship. And then maybe the person, who was not comfortable with multicultural pulpit, can be challenged, first of all, and then maybe he or she can think seriously why the pulpit should be open to different culture. And then, other committee members who support, the sharing the pulpit with the different cultural people may eventually, they help him or her to transform, his or her own perspective on the pulpit. Yeah, so I think, just, I think that is one of the ways. And then, yeah.
Well, I wanted to add one more thing to that. It had a wonderful ending. About 3 months after that man stopped coming to church, one Sunday he showed up with his wife, with the person he was married to, I should say. And I said, well, what brings you back? And he pointed to her. And it made a big difference in the church at that time. He said, I came back because she made me come back.
Our last question.
Dr. Kim, I serve in a United Methodist Church, and we have congregational developments moving towards cooperative parishes. And these are like 4 to 6 churches combined, served by a leadership team of elders, deacons, seminarians, local pastors, whatnot. And so your idea of a preaching committee is very inspiring because you're restructuring and we can do creative and more innovative things as a preaching team. Can you name 2 or 3 things that makes a preaching committee different from what we may be familiar with a lectionary group?
I see. Well, I do not know what your lectionary group is doing, but in my local church context, I'm a Presbyterian, and the Denver Presbytery offers lectionary group. The 2 local pastors that they come and join and then study together once a month, and then they got just some theological or biblical ideas, and then they just spread to their own churches and preach. And then some churches have a lectionary Bible study groups, with the congregation members, so perhaps maybe you mean that one? So what kind of lectionary group?
The lectionary group I'm familiar with, mostly clergy that get together once a week and share.
Like our Presbyterian level Bible study group. Yeah, and the lectionary group focuses on biblical interpretation for preaching, and then theological, the understanding of the special seasons in the church calendar. However, for preaching committee, it has more role. For example, I live offered the dean program for many years in preaching, and then one of the requirements for the students was to organize their sermon preparation and feedback group. That is exactly what I mean, preaching committee. So we require students to select 5 or 6 people among their congregation members, and then it must include a kind of diversity in gender, age, if possible sexuality, and race. And so 5 or 6 different, culturally different people come together, and then they think together how our sermons can be spiritually more helpful to our congregation, particularly culturally different congregation. So, based on our idea of shared preaching, we encourage, this group to lead the preparation or plan for sermons for 6 months or for 3 months, or based on lectionary calendar, like seasons. And then also, we encourage students to have, the Bible study, like a lectionary Bible study with the congregation members, one of the weekdays. And then, or some groups had actually in the morning, on Sundays, before they had, the Sunday worship services. But the preaching committee's role is not only to participate in this lectionary or biblical passage-oriented Bible study, but also they just, brainstorm how to design the sermon to be more shared with other church members. And then, are there some people who are very good in singing in relation to the theme of this sermon, or any liturgical dancer, or any musical instruments? So, they provide some ideas, and they also recruit, some members. And then the sermon itself can be done with preaching community members, not only just one person like preacher or pastor. Preaching can be a shared preaching. So in other words, as I already mentioned, the group sermon on the issue of immigration was preached with 5 people, 4 people. So I mentioned in my presentation. So that kind of, the group teamwork can be done even on the stage, in other words, the behind the pulpit or on the chancel. So preaching is not simply a monologue, but it can be a dialogue. And the preaching committee's role is to participate in performance. And then the most important thing is that they provide feedback to some, the service. They don't have to meet every Sunday. Sometimes it's too much, the commitment. But the worship committee or preaching committee can meet maybe once a week, to give some general or comprehensive feedback, and then talk about the directions, theological directions, or the liturgical directions to their congregational worship. So, the worship committee and preaching committee, these 2 committees are very important, I think, because I teach these 2 areas, so I'm very prejudiced. Yeah. And the preaching committee's role is recruiting partners and planning and preparing, and then also performing together, and then providing feedback of the sermon series for each sermon.
Thank you. Wow, we heard really great ideas today, and thank you for our great presenters.